Cup 2015 is under starters orders, and here we go.
One of the most famous victories in the history of sport, I'd go as far as saying.
Wales have done it! They have beaten England at Twickenham!
It's picked up by the skipper, scored! Stunning comeback by Romania.
Anthony Watson! Australia have dumped the hosts out of the competition.
Devastated, gutted. As a team, we feel we've let the country down.
Crouch! Bind, set!
Strike back with their first try.
Serbia! See you later!
Oh my goodness me.
Look at it, moving towards the trial!
The Irishman does it. Heartbreak for Scotland. Slips it away to Billy De Gea, and De Gea for the try.
Take a bow, this man, Richie McCaw. He's led his team to another World Cup victory and another World Cup next weekend.
Seen so many great games, so many great occasions, and this we hope is going to be the best of them all. Absolutely typical New Zealand skills. Dan Carter. The All Blacks' greatest ever era. Playing heroes in 2015. Now it'll be Japan's turn to host in 2019, and everybody wishes them well.
Some VT, that.
Yeah, good memories. Not so much for an Englishman and a Scotsman, maybe, but good memories.
Before we get into the intros, we should probably touch on that. We saw probably not enough, really, of what Japan did in that World Cup. Was that the turning point for Japan, for Asian rugby? Japan, that's a significant result in the last World Cup against the two-time winning champion South Africa.
Yeah, look, I think sensational moment for Japanese rugby. I mean, Japan have been in every Rugby World Cup since the first one back in obviously '87, and have had, you know, tough World Cups and probably not got the results they deserve. And I think for them to turn over South Africa in the opening game for them in that tournament was incredible. And people might be aware, but the audiences for the Japan games after that were incredible. They had 25 million people in Japan watching their next match against Samoa for a game effectively in the middle of the night. And that's the impact, I think, that a World Cup can have on interest in rugby. And that's why it's so important to us.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, I'll probably introduce myself. I'm Jim Hamilton. I'm working for rugbypass.com, streaming company. If you want to watch rugby in Asia, any game whatsoever, check out rugbypass.com. But also, I did play rugby, retired about 3 months ago, played 10 years for Scotland, who actually played in 2 World Cups, one in France in 2007 and the New Zealand one in 2011. And we were speaking backstage in terms of the kind of planning that goes in as a player is very short. It's a 6-week build-up. You go to the tournament, you play. If you play for Scotland like I did, you lose, you go home. and you repeat, but there's a significant amount of planning that goes into the World Cup. Can you just talk a little bit about what's gone into this one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, we work now on a kind of 6-year cycle for World Cup, so a bit different to the sort of 6 weeks preparation. So we're working 6 years for a 6-week tournament, and there is a huge amount, like there is for any big event, you know, across sport and music, and we'll talk later, I'm sure, about Tokyo 2020. But we awarded World Cup 2019 to Japan actually back in 2009 at the same time that England were awarded the World Cup you've just seen there. And you know, we've had a long time working with the Japanese to build up for this, and you need to do that in a country that's less experienced, I guess, in organising big events, and particularly in rugby terms. You know, and there is a huge amount of work that goes into it, both in terms of making sure the event runs well and everything that you see there on the pitch is achievable. But you know, really for us, it's about making sure once every 4 years you can really project the sport and get, you know, an audience excited in a way that they're not excited maybe week in, week out. And you know, we've seen with Rugby World Cup in 2015 and some of the stats you saw there, the phenomenal social media impressions, the incredible television audiences, and rugby's inclusion in the Olympic Games in Rio. We've just seen this incredible growth in the audience for rugby because it's those big shiny moments that attract a younger audience that's important to all of us, important to our commercial partners, and attracts people into the sport. And it's not just about those who want to play the game, it's about those who want to touch the game in any sort of way.
And again, we're 2 years out, so from an ex-player's point of view, it's miles away. From your point of view, It's probably just around the corner. Have there been any exceptional challenges along the way that you're happy to talk about? Yeah,
look, I think, and we touched on it at the end of the VT, and we certainly talk about it a lot. It's the first World Cup in Asia. It's not just the first World Cup in Asia for us, it's the first Rugby World Cup outside of the kind of traditional rugby strongholds that we've played the tournament in. So that definitely presents some challenges. It creates some nervousness. You know, will we have sold out stadiums? Will we have the same level of audience engagement and fan engagement we've had in previous World Cups? And I think the answer is yes, we will. And we're confident about that, not just because of Japan's results in 2015, but because of the way that rugby's been embraced in Japan. But the unique challenges are, again, working with a more inexperienced organising committee. We're working with 12 fantastic host cities in Japan, but they don't know what it means to host a Rugby World Cup. Some of them were involved in a Football World Cup back in 2002, so they have that as a kind of benchmark. But so those challenges, you know, are multiple and are unique, and this is a really critical year now for Japan 2019, and they know it. There's a lot to get right, particularly in the promotion of the tournament. But it's about the opportunity, and I think, yes, there are some unique challenges, but the opportunity that a World Cup in a country like Japan gives us, not just to make sure that it leaves a legacy for Japanese rugby, but that it leaves a legacy for Asian rugby, and how we make sure we project the sport across Asia and really leave something meaningful behind.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And we were chatting behind about the kind of the overall growth of rugby in Asia. And again, I feel that I can say this because, believe it or not, 6'8", 6'10" with high heels, that I am a quarter Chinese. So I am well embedded into the kind of Asian rugby, and I'm passionate about the growth of rugby here. I think there's a huge market for growth. In sport's huge, but especially in rugby, that's still quite an immature sport across the world. You know, when I speak about rugby in Asia, and I don't mean Japan, because Japan's slightly different because they are slightly more established, but I mean Asia as a whole, do you feel they're going to come across certain cultural struggles in terms of academia being at the front of the queue as opposed to sport, rugby being quite a scary sport if you never watched rugby in your life and you're a parent, wanting to get your child into it? It's a very combative sport. How do you see the growth of that in Asia? Obviously, the World Cup's going to help that, but probably going forward, I know it's quite a long-winded question that we can talk about, but the growth of rugby across all boards of Asia, not just in Japan. Yeah,
no, I think someone mentioned it on the previous panel we just overheard. I mean, I think, you know, there's a danger that you treat Asia as one region and you take this kind of, okay, what are we going to do for rugby in Asia approach? And it's certainly not, and we do work with our members and our regional association here in Asia to try and understand that what's going to work in China and what's going to work in India and what's going to work in Malaysia and Indonesia and all those different countries are probably different things. I think one thing we do know, and again, Tokyo 2020 has got a massively important role to play in this, is that rugby sevens is probably a more easily consumed form of the game in Asia than 15s, and you're right to say I think that Japan's probably the exception to that, because 15s is such a well-established sport in Japan, and they've got that kind of high school and university heritage in 15-a-side rugby that the rest of Asia doesn't really have. So sevens is definitely hugely important for us in Asia, and we've seen through the HSBC World Rugby Sevens Series that we have both men's and women's events in Asia, and one of them every year here in Singapore, that there's a great audience for rugby sevens. It's easier to understand, obviously. It's therefore easier to understand and play. I think we'll see more boys and girls in Asia playing or coming into rugby through playing sevens than we will the traditional 15-a-side game. And I think we'll see a bigger audience attracted to it for the same reason. And I think the Olympics in 2020 in Tokyo will play a massive role in projecting rugby across Asia. And we're doing a lot of work currently in developing the sport, particularly in China, and again, sevens is right at the forefront of that. Sevens will be the way I think we get to the audience, and it will be a question then of how much of that audience becomes a 15-a-side audience as well.
Yeah, because we're seeing the game in the UK, rugby's huge. In New Zealand, it's the biggest sport they've got there. In the US, it's growing. How long do you think it's going to take? And I know it's quite a throwaway question. What's the ambition of World Rugby to grow in Asia? It is a long-term plan. We saw the investment that Alibaba put into China. Again, it's not quite Japan. We're here to talk more about that. But this has got to be a long-term plan. It's not a short-term fix to grow the game of rugby.
I think the commitments, it's this there, it's 100%. I think it's the region of the world, or again, the collection of regions and territories where we see the most potential. We're doing a lot of work in the States. Rugby's very well established in most parts of South America, obviously strong in Europe and Australia and New Zealand. And Asia, we look at it and you think, okay, there's 60% of the world's youth population in a territory where rugby's not really being played, apart from in Japan, as we've said. So huge opportunity. We've got a big responsibility in terms of growing the sport to make sure we invest sustainably, I guess, and in the right way in Asia. And we're working with our broadcast partners and corporate partners, to really try and push the game into those new territories. So no, definitely a huge ambition for Asia and a huge commitment to Asia. But what we're seeing, and I'm sure all other sports are seeing, is there is no simple answer to that challenge, and also there's no kind of one size fits all. And as I said, what might work in China versus what might work in Singapore versus what might work in India are probably very different approaches. But our ambition is to make sure that there are more boys and girls, men and women, not only playing the game but watching the game, all the infrastructure that goes behind that, so refereeing, coaching, volunteering and being involved. And we believe that rugby's values and the kind of character building side of rugby actually resonates really well in Asia. It's just how do you tell that story better? Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the women's game there, and it's interesting actually that this part of the world, that Hong Kong women's actually played in the World Cup. Yep. Albeit they struggled slightly. They were first up against New Zealand, which was always going to be tough. But in terms of the growth of the women's game, we were chatting again before, because that's what we do. In terms of the traditional broadcast that lay behind that was not maybe a focal point. It was more the kind of social media, the Facebook Live, that got huge interaction around the women's game. So one question would be, is that a focus in Asia, or are we solely looking for to grow it in the men's and then look to the women's? Are we looking to combine them? And then also the kind of the platforms that we're looking to engage them on as well? Yeah, again, I think if you're looking at, and Asia's a good example because it's not an established rugby market, and it is that younger audience that we're aiming for. I think you've got to be smart about looking at different ways of reaching that audience. And I think we know that to reach that younger audience, you've got to be putting your content on the platforms where they consume their entertainment. So we've definitely, and the Women's World Cup was probably just the first example of that, because we had the opportunity this year to do that. We looked at Facebook, obviously huge social media interactions, and in the future, with the likes of Amazon and Netflix coming into sport, there are obviously ever more kind of creative ways, shall we say, to get the content out there. So definitely it's a strategy going forward, and Asia is a region where we can really attack that strategy, because we're not looking, probably, in all honesty, for the same dollars that we're looking for in the established markets. And quite simplistically, we think to ourselves, okay, well, we're going to get the money we need to invest in the sport out of the places where broadcasters will pay us the most for the rights, and we're going to use the more creative and innovative ways to broadcast the sport and let people consume the sport in the territories where we're not sacrificing really any meaningful dollars. And again, our broadcasters and the sponsors that we deal with, are a huge part of that story for us. They are the investors in the sport, and from a World Rugby perspective, we're putting as much of that money back into the sport directly as we can, and the content strategy that sits behind that is a big part of that investment. We recognise that you've got to get that younger audience excited about your sport to have a chance of capturing their imagination.
Yeah, we were saying again that content, for me personally, being 34, having just come out of the game, and having 2 young children, and the way that they kind of consume sport is a way in which people my age and older don't feel that they should consume sport that way, which is ultimately through the tablet. They're always on their phone, and they very rarely sit and watch a game of rugby or a game of sport on the big screen, do they? So a lot of them look at what lies around that content. I really think there is an opportunity in the market, especially around rugby, that sometimes has been categorised as fairly old-fashioned. I would say it's still very immature, it's still a very young sport in terms of growth and the social and the digital aspects of that. But I think that especially around the sevens, there can be some really good content made that can engage people that maybe don't know, because it is a very tough game to understand the rules, especially in 15. So if you've never watched the game of rugby and you watch New Zealand do the haka, you're thinking, wow, what's going to happen here? It looks like it's going to be a war, and there's a lot more that goes around that. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, look, I think absolutely. I think again, particularly with sevens for new audiences, there's a great opportunity to kind of engage people with heroes. And again, that younger audience, it's not maybe so much about following your national team or following a club team. It's about, I actually want to see these superstars. Whether it's Sonny Bill Williams or Carlin Isles in the States running against Usain Bolt, virtually as it were. So there's a chance to really pull out these kind of characters of the game, and again, probably more in sevens to attract that younger audience. And we were talking before, Jim, you look at what your kids do with FIFA as a computer game. They don't see FIFA as this kind of dry international federation. They see FIFA as this brilliant computer game that they interact with, and the whole kind of gaming and esports strategy. And again, rugby's got a lot of work to do, in all honesty, to get into that space and start to engage that audience. But with the Sevens World Series that we have, and again, I know our friends at HSBC, constantly rightly challenging us to say, make this a more innovative, relevant product for a younger audience. Get out there and make heroes out of these incredible athletes, because that's what's going to attract a younger audience. That's what's going to help us all grow that audience together, and that's exactly how we're approaching the sport going forward. And the Olympics, again, give you this great opportunity to just take sevens and throw it onto the biggest possible stage and turn those guys and girls into stars.
Yeah, definitely. And we should talk about Japan, and we should go back to that historic moment in England. Was it up in Newcastle?
No, down in Brighton.
Down in Brighton, yeah, it was. So on the coast, I would probably say, a non-established rugby, small seaside town in the UK. I mean, that was a huge moment. Would you say in Asia or for Japan? I mean, from what I was hearing and seeing, I mean, we all saw the celebrations and what it meant, not just to the players, but did it make front page news in Japan? Am I right in saying?
Yeah, I think it was a huge moment for rugby. I mean, certainly in Japan, obviously, an incredible national pride and big sort of audiences that followed, as I said. I'd like to think it was a big moment for Asian rugby, because it's a demonstration that an Asian team can go and compete on that stage, in a Rugby World Cup. It took Japan a long time to get there. Over the years, they've competed. They've produced some great players over the years. They've now produced a great team. Hopefully, they'll continue to build towards 2019. But again, when we think about that in the kind of Asian context, is what does that mean? What hope does that give China? What hope does that give India? What hope does that give the other countries that are competing throughout Asia and trying to qualify? And you mentioned just now, I mean, we just had Hong Kong and Japan compete in the Women's Rugby World Cup last month. And, I think for Hong Kong in particular, it wasn't so much a case of where they finished in the tournament, but the fact that they actually made it to the top 12 teams in the world and got to a Rugby World Cup in the women's game was a massive achievement for them. And again, I think those small victories, if you like, not that Japan's win against South Africa was a small victory, are just showing the development of the sport in Asia. The game against South Africa, I mean, I spend a lot of time now in Japan, particularly in Tokyo. I'm back in Tokyo this week, and I'm I'm fairly sick of watching that game now, I must admit. I'm looking forward to Japan's next big scout so we can watch something other than just the replays of that game, but a massive moment for the sport.
Yeah, so coming on to that, as a host nation, notoriously, how much pressure is on for Japan to do well at this next World Cup? We saw, and the big teams in terms of New Zealand when they're at home, there's a huge expectation from all the crowd at home for them to win it. Not just to do well, of course, the expectation's high. The same we saw England, they were awful at the last World Cup at home, and ended up actually off the back of that bringing in the Japan coach, Eddie Jones. I imagine it's going to be slightly different. Japan, they've got a tough group. They've got the Scots in there, my former team. So that's going to be a tough game. But look, it's going to be tough for Japan as a team. Unsure how far they've actually grown under the reign of Eddie Jones. What expectations are going to be put on that team externally?
Yeah. Look, big challenge for them, huge challenge for them. They're in a group, as you said, with Scotland and Ireland. Every group's tough, in a World Cup, and rightly so. I think, maybe England showed in 2015 that it's in the World Cup environment now. It's not about the host winning for the tournament to be successful. So that's encouraging for us from a Rugby World Cup and World Rugby perspective. In Japan, probably national pride will drive a lot of the media coverage of the tournament. So we'll need their media to stay engaged with us for 6 weeks, even if Japan get knocked out. That's a bigger challenge than it would have been in England. I don't think it'll be a challenge with the Japanese public. I think they'll turn up in their droves, not just to watch Japan, but to watch a World Cup in their home city, their hometown, etc. And they're great sports fans and great fans of big events. So I don't think there's pressure in that sense. But they will put themselves under pressure. It's probably a question best asked to Jamie Joseph, but they're under big pressure, and the results haven't gone their way for the last couple of years. I mean, they played a test series against Ireland this year and Scotland last year and have suffered some narrow defeats, but they're on the way back up, I think, and there'll be big pressure that they'll put on themselves to be successful.
Am I right in saying the winner of that group will potentially go on to play New Zealand?
Probably the runner-up in that group. So the winner of that, well, I mean, that's assuming New Zealand will win their group, but that's probably relatively. They're in a group with South Africa, so there's a huge pool match there in Pool B. But yeah, probably whoever is the runner-up in Pool A will play New Zealand. So that's your reward for getting through to a quarter-final, which is always a bit of a tough one.
Yeah, I think everyone would love to see a New Zealand-Japan game. That'd be amazing. And
Japan putting out New Zealand in the quarterfinals would be.
Could you imagine? The game will definitely grow then if that's the case. So in terms of a legacy going forward, we've seen, and again, my unexpert opinion of legacies in terms of Olympics, such work and effort goes in. I mean, I say non-expert opinion. I looked at what's happened at Rio. It's actually quite shocking in terms of what's been left behind. There's absolutely nothing, empty stadiums. So in Japan, this is a huge moment because rugby is definitely on the up. It's the first time, obviously, hosted down in Asia. So, not just in Japan, so it's huge for Asia. What is the legacy that you're expecting, that you're wanting, that's achievable, I suppose?
Yeah. Look, good question. It's a massively important area of any tournament now. And I think the mistake that was made, if you go back, back in time a little bit, whether you're talking about football World Cups or Rugby World Cups or Olympic Games, is everyone starts talking about legacy as the event happens or just after. And of course, like anything, if you don't plan it from the start, then you're never going to achieve those goals. So, we've been talking about legacy with Japan, right from the moment the tournament was awarded to them back in 2009, and it's a massive part of the delivery of the event. And it's about kind of three things. One is legacy in terms of infrastructure. So Japan will be left with a far better rugby infrastructure than they've got now. More venues, more training venues, better coaches, better volunteering system that sits around the sport, which will enable more people to play the game and play it at whatever level they want to compete at. So there's that rugby legacy piece from an infrastructure perspective. There's hopefully the audience piece, so a lot more people interested in the sport and watching the sport and consuming the sport in every way. And then there's the wider Asia piece for us. How do you make sure that legacy doesn't just happen in Japan, in the host territory, but happens outside of Japan and across Asia? And we've worked over the last couple of years closely with Asia Rugby as a regional association for us to try and find projects that you can attach the World Cup to. And we're working particularly, again, with China, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, 4 or 5 other key territories to say, okay, let's use World Cup as a reason why we want more kids playing the sport. So the project in mind is Asia 1 million, which is the objective is to have 1 million new players in Asia. Started about 2 years ago by the time the World Cup finishes in 2019, and that's on track. That's big investment, not only from World Rugby, but also from the Japanese government, you know, investing in I guess, kind of sports tourism as well, which is one of their goals, both from Rugby World Cup 2019 and Tokyo 2020. So, yeah, legacy is a big part of Rugby World Cup. I think the challenge for our colleagues, for example, in the IOC and for Olympic Games is different, because you're dealing with so many sports that legacy means different things to different sports. It means obviously different things to the different stakeholders involved in Olympic Games, and the constructions on such a huge scale. It's an incredibly complex part of the Olympics to get right. I think Tokyo have got very solid legacy plans in terms of the use of those venues, for example, going forward beyond 2020, that maybe Rio didn't have, sadly. You know, we look back certainly at the rugby legacy in Brazil. Rugby's being played in more parts of Brazil as a result of Rio 2016 than it was before. The union is much stronger, the federation in Brazil. So the sport had a legacy in Brazil. Maybe the headlines are being made by the sort of venues that aren't being used, you know, for example, and that's probably the part that Rio got wrong.
Yeah. So maybe one of the final questions. So in 10 years' time, okay, long way away, where do we want to see rugby in Asia on a whole? I'm not talking specifically, you know, numbers of playing, but I'm talking in terms of, from a World Rugby's point of view. So Asia's a huge market. It's been a good few years leading to the point of where we're at now. You mentioned 2009 was the World Cup for Japan. So in 10 years' time, where do we want to see rugby in Asia at?
I think what we want to see rugby as globally is a mainstream sport. You know, football's out there from a mass participation, mass interest perspective, you know, and so far beyond where other sports are that, you know, it's probably not a great comparison. But for us, it's about rugby in all parts of the world being seen as a mainstream sport. It's about being on school curriculums, for example. It's about an acceptance of rugby as a kind of sport in all of its different forms. And kind of winning the hearts and minds battles. So I think, and Asia's a huge part of that, again, because it's such a significant part of the world in terms of population, the number of countries involved. You know, we've got a responsibility to our game to be a big sport in Asia. So, you know, hopefully in 10 years' time we look back and rugby's conquered Asia in the sort of nicest possible sense. But, you know, I think, you know, we really feel that rugby is a sport that would, you know, again, I go back to the values piece, and the values-based part of rugby really resonates well in Asia. And I think, you know, from an interest and an audience and a participation point of view, Asia should be a really important territory for rugby.
And are we hoping that coaches, potentially from the UK, ex-players from the UK, New Zealand, France, will come to Asia and teach schools, children, clubs, anyone involved in rugby, the way to go forward? Because what I think is rugby is a difficult game to get hold of. If you've never seen the game of rugby, it's difficult to grasp the rules. You can't just expect someone to go on a coaching course and learn and expect. I think the hope is, and we've seen Robbie Deans is in Japan, you'll probably know more. Eddie Jones was here, world-class coach. I think in the next 3, 4, 5 years, after the World Cup, it would be great to see some of the coaches, the more high-profile coaches and players from the game come to Japan and Asia.
Yeah, look, we're seeing that in Japan, which is great. You've got a wealth of talent in terms of playing and coaching talent in Japan that's definitely raised. You know, that's one of the reasons why I think Japan have probably been successful more recently, is they've had the benefit of that experience from overseas coming into their game. Of course, in the short term, you need that, as you say, to establish the sport. It is a complex sport to establish, far more so than football or basketball or some other sports that obviously we're competing for attention with, and you know, coaching, officiating, the structure that you need around rugby definitely creates that challenge. I mean, in the relationship we have with Ali Sports in China, for example, where we're looking at a project to create up to 5 million players over 10 years, and the investment that Ali Sports are putting into rugby, which is, you know, fantastic, and we need more of that again to help us grow the sport. You know, when you start to break those numbers down, it's quite scary. In the first 2 to 3 years to start that journey, it's not actually about attracting the players, because we've got nowhere for them to play. We've got to train probably 30,000 coaches and 15,000 match officials before we can start attracting the players. So those become the challenges, I guess, from an infrastructure point of view. Those become the things that require the big investment. The importance of things like Rugby World Cup and, again, Olympic Games alongside that are to make sure that we nail the big events so that when we have that structure in place, we've got, you know, huge numbers of boys and girls wanting to play the game. So it's those big, shiny things and our events that draw the attention. Meanwhile, hopefully, a huge amount of work going on behind the scenes to prepare the landscape, I guess, for that.
Yeah, you mentioned China there and the investment from Alibaba. Is that a sustainable investment, would you say? I'm in agreement with you. You know, I would love to see the game of rugby grow across all of Asia. I think Japan are slightly more established, and I think I can say this as well, is they're more attuned to the combat sports. We see them in mixed martial arts. A few of the guys that play for the Japan national team are from Polynesian descent, so your Tongans, your Samoa, the islands that breed rugby players, big men by their sheer mass. Chinese, notoriously, apart from the odd 6'8" person walking around, or your Yao Ming, are notoriously quite a small nation. So the investment from Alibaba is great. Is that sustainable? Is there a real opportunity in China to grow the game in 15s? Because look how long it's taken in England, in the UK, to grow the game in terms of the men's established, the women's now established, and everything that lies beneath that, sustainability through grassroots.
Yeah. Look, I guess the responsibility is to make sure it's sustainable. So to have the likes of Ali Sports invest in rugby is a great opportunity for us. And we've got to make sure with them in that partnership that money is invested in a sustainable development sense. I think, again, going back to what we said earlier, I think Sevens probably for Asia, as it is for a number of kind of development territories, the US is another good example, is the sort of the quick route to success in terms of growing the sport. 15s takes a lot longer to establish for sure. You know, and again, you know, from a physicality point of view, as you mentioned, maybe Sevens is an easier sport for people to understand and consume. It, you know, also attracts boys and girls to play that kind of dynamic version of the sport more quickly. That's not to say, and I think we believe that through a program of coaching and development in China, you can establish Sevens and 15s. Sevens might just happen that bit faster. And again, you know, Sevens being an Olympic sport allows us the opportunity to talk with government agencies about the sport being on school curriculum, that kids are, you know, engaged with and learning rugby much earlier than they would be just from trying to establish a club network. So yeah, there's definitely a huge amount of that investment will certainly be targeted towards the Sevens game. I think the other thing to say, you know, you mentioned the sort of combative nature of rugby, is wherever we are in the world, like a lot of sports, you know, but particularly any combative sport, you know, we're looking at the issues of player welfare, and that's a huge priority for us, and big stories that go with concussion. But concussion isn't the only player welfare story. You know, rugby's an attritional sport. And a sport that, you know, is hugely physical, and we've got a responsibility as World Rugby, I think, to make sure we're also growing the kind of non-contact versions of the game. So tag and touch rugby are a hugely important part of the growth of rugby going forward. You know, it's not going to be all about 15-a-side traditional rugby. It's going to be about rugby in all its forms. And really, for us, if people are playing, watching, interested in rugby in any of its forms, that's growth in the game, and therefore that's success.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned as well about the Sevens, because we were chatting as well about the kind of size that Hong Kong Sevens has now generated. And it's interesting, some facts and figures, whether or not they're true. I think 60%, maybe 70% of people that go to the Sevens there actually don't understand rugby, but what they love, they like the partying and the fancy dress and the alcohol part of going to the Sevens. But that's what rugby is as well. It isn't necessarily all about what's on the pitch. It's everything that lies around it, the values, the fact that you can go there and be sociable. It isn't like football. I love football, but it isn't like going to, you know, you're taking your kids to a game of football. You're hearing every swear word under the sun that should be in the swear word dictionary. In rugby, that isn't the case. I think people come together. I think the Sevens is a great example about that. It isn't just about what goes on the pitch. It's about everything that is around it and the fun. And I know with World Rugby, that's a huge part of rugby, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think, you know, anecdotally, and England 2015 as a World Cup was a good example, exactly that. Rugby is a very different experience for the fan from other sports and particularly from football. And hosting a Rugby World Cup in England and playing a Rugby World Cup actually in some very traditional football stadiums, as we did. Brighton, we mentioned, St James's Park in Newcastle, the Manchester City Stadium, for example, and you're drawing on an audience that isn't necessarily a rugby audience, which of course is exactly what we want to do. But the surprise at some of those fans when they get to a stadium, and not only are they enjoying hopefully the product on the pitch, but they're realising, my God, you've got the Argentinian fan sat next to the South African fan. There's no segregation of fans in rugby, and obviously the camaraderie that goes with that, which is very much part, obviously, of the sport on and off the field, is fantastic. And we're trying to export that, I guess, wherever we go, and create that fan experience. And again, Sevens is probably right at the peak of that fan experience. Great party atmosphere, incredible, compelling sport on the field of play, but also an incredible kind of atmosphere and festival around it. And whether it's Hong Kong, which is probably the kind of most famous part of that, through to Dubai, through to the event that we have now here in Singapore, it's another way of attracting people into the sport. And we've got to hold on to that and hold on to the values that underpin that and make sure they continue to sort of differentiate us from other forms of sport and entertainment, definitely.
Brilliant. And just before we finish, this will be the last question. So let's finish on the World Cup. And you have touched on it in long form of answer. What is going to be the success? So we're 2 years out now from the World Cup. What is going to be a successful World Rugby? And in a nutshell, what are we hoping for from this up-and-coming World Cup?
Look, I think success for us looks like a great World Cup that attracts a bigger audience. So, successful delivery of the tournament in Japan, as we've said, will leave all kinds of tangible legacies for rugby in Japan and hopefully more widely. But at a kind of really sort of high level, success is a tournament that engages a bigger audience around the world and continues to grow the sport, continues to bring more investment into the sport, because World Cup's that one chance we have every 4 years to really bring in a huge amount of investment. So yeah, success is Japan 2019 being, I guess, the next step on the continued growth journey, and World Cup's been a really important part of that for World Rugby over the last almost 30 years. And this one, provides us with a great opportunity to continue it in a part of the world that we've not been in before. Yeah,
that's really good. I'm really excited now. I'm a spectator on this side of the fence, not on the field anymore, and I can see the amount of work that guys like you put in for, the World Cup, not just the World Cup, but events throughout the year. So I'm hugely excited. Just to recap, any of you guys and ladies out there who haven't watched rugby and would like to watch rugby, if you go onto rugbypass.com, you can live stream any game whatsoever in World Rugby. So you've got a 2-year lead up now to get on and learn about all the rules. But from me and Alan, thanks very much for listening, and we're incredibly excited about the growth of rugby and the opportunities in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.